Assalamu alaikum and welcome. I'm your host, Hannah Zuberi, and we welcome you back to another episode of Justice for All Now. With protests and demonstrations taking place all around the United States, one of the demands many protesters have, in addition to the defunding of different police departments that we spoke about earlier, is prison abolition. And while many African Americans are disproportionately targeted and engulfed into the often unjust prison system, there also remains a large amount of Muslims in the American prison system as well. Taking place in the Bronzeville neighborhood of Southside Chicago tomorrow, June 12th, will be a march demanding the defunding of police and to abolish the prison system. Joining us today will be Imam Tariq Al-Amin. And before I bring Imam Tariq on board, and he's going to be leading the march for Believers Bailout, I wanted to read a quote that by Ruth Wilson Gilmore about abolition, because this is because a lot of people have questions about this, and they often wonder, what are you going to do with the rapists on the streets and things? You want to let Klan members back on the street, things like that. That is what usually people come back. Those are some of the comebacks that people have. And she responds that abolition is a practical program of change rooted in how people sustain and improve their lives, cobbling together insights and strategies from disparate, connected struggles. We know we won't bulldoze prisons and jails tomorrow, but as long as they continue to be advanced as the solution, all of the inequalities displaced to crime and punishment will persist. We're in a long game. So part of this long game is Imam Tariq Al-Amin. Imam Tariq is the resident imam of Masjid al-Taqwa in Chicago. He's the former daily host and producer of Radio Islam USA on WCEV 1450 AM in Chicago, Illinois, where he conducted hundreds of interviews on politics, social justice, interfaith cooperation, activism, and more. We'll be discussing the prison abolition, systematic injustices, and what Islam has to say about these matters. Imam Tariq now serves as the Director of Civic Engagement and Interfaith Services for the Council of Islamic Organizations of Greater Chicago, and is also the founder of Bridging the Gap. Bridging the Gap is a 501c3 nonprofit service organization dedicated to the betterment of society through the formation, development, and strengthening of community bonds through service, fellowship, education, enrichment, and civil engagement. Welcome to the show, Imam Tariq.
Thank you so much, Sister Hannah. Assalamu alaikum to the viewers. May the peace that only God can give be upon each and every one of you. I just wanted to clarify something really quickly. So I'm not going to be leading the march. I am in 100% support. I look forward to participating, and inshallah, with God's permission, I'll be giving the khutbah, the sermon, inshallah.
So in Islamic terminology, that's the position. SubhanAllah, you're leading the khutbah, you're leading the march.
I don't want to take away from any of the hard work, Dr. Mariam Kashani and all the volunteers, the staff that have put forth in organizing this. So I'm pleased to be able to support that work.
Alhamdulillah, that's excellent. So Imam Tariq, for the audience who perhaps some of them know you from Radio Islam, and for some of them who are new to your work, tell us a little bit more about yourself and some of the work that you do.
I'm a lifelong Chicagoan. Grew up in the Englewood and the Auburn Gresham areas. I guess service has always been a big part of my life, of my upbringing. The arts have been an extremely big part of that, and I think that is where, kind of fast forwarding to my tenure at Radio Islam, where that kind of intersected. The idea of interviewing and storytelling, and its impact on being able to broaden people's perspectives and introduce them to new ideas and bring them into conversation with folks that they might not otherwise have the opportunity to do so. So, as you mentioned, I've been the Imam of Masjid Al Taqwa for the past, the resident imam for the past 7 years. I've served as an imam for just about 20 years. I was an assistant imam at the Ibn Bahar Cultural Center um, for about 12, 11, 12 years. And the goal, the focus has always been, how do we implement our understanding of what it means to be a quote unquote good Muslim, right? Which really translates into stewardship. We have this term for our non Arabic speaking or non people who are not familiar with the terminology of Islam. This term Khalifa, which is um, basically a steward, right? A vicegerent, a steward, which is what we see ourselves as, inheriting the prophetic legacy and the trust of our father Adam. And like, what does that mean on a day-to-day basis, with regard to how I engage the community around me, not just those who share my beliefs, as Muslims, but my neighbors, right? So in Islam, we place a great burden of responsibility on ourselves in being good neighbors. And being a good neighbor means that we advocate for our neighbors, right? We advocate for our neighbors as we would advocate for ourselves. So that pushes us into civic engagement, that pushes us into politics, it pushes us into interfaith conversations, it pushes us into trying to right systemic wrongs, which is, kind of part and parcel if we think about what the Quran as a revelation building upon the previous revelations within the Abrahamic faiths. Um, we see that it's really about us bringing about social equity and justice and peace through our connection to Allah, through our connection to the divine. And and that means it pushes us, like I said, into those other spaces. So I have spent, I guess, the past 20 years or so consciously focused on trying to grow and trying to find ways that I can serve that end, where that my belief serves that end about um, bringing about a better representation of our human potential, as a believer.
SubhanAllah. And this has brought, as you were saying, your position and the work that you have done in other aspects of, um, you know, basically your daily work has brought you in spaces where. So, have you often found yourself to be the only Black Muslim there?
Um, in which just like in the broader community spaces. Yeah. Well, I should say so. By trade, I'm a journeyman iron worker, which is a skill building trade.
Okay.
Um, Now I got to see some of the, and this may be kind of jumping off into a different thought stream, but I was used to being the only, not just the only Muslim, but the only African American on multiple construction sites. Um, and that speaks to another disparity, in terms of, what career paths are open, what some of the existing kind of embedded racism within our union structures. Um, but that would also translate to, they're I think naturally, seeing as how we're, as Muslims, 1% of the population, it would make sense that there would be spaces that I would go into where I would be not only the only Muslim, but also the only African American. So you get the double whammy, double marginalization. So yeah, long answer to say yes.
And so, while you've been engaged, so how have you been engaged in addressing these recent events after the death of George Floyd? And I know we had you earlier. We were talking about some of these things even earlier before the death of George Floyd, and then his death happened, and everything sort of it became a snowball. And um, so, in light of his very extremely tragic death, is um, what? How have your past few weeks played out? Like, what have I know there's a big demand on Black Muslim leadership these days. How have you coped, and what have you been doing?
Well, since the murder of George Floyd, we have been. I think we've been engaged in a lot of conversations around, semantics around what are the right words to use to describe where we are right now, and for some, we kind of talk about this as an awakening,
Mm-hmm.
where people are saying, oh, when we're finally getting it, and Black folk in general are saying, well, no, this is nothing new to us, right? We've been saying this thing the whole time, and for whatever reason, at this point, it seems to have gathered the attention not just of the nation, but I think globally, because we see we see so many different uh, instances where people are rising up against racist statues, pulling them down around the world, speaking out against whatever forms of police brutality and a lack of accountability that exists in their particular societies. But in terms of how, on a personal level, how I have processed it, and how I've observed others, similarly situated, it has been one where, on one hand, it is there's a sense of, I don't want to say disbelief, but a sense of kind of surprise to say, you didn't really realize that this was the conditions that we were living under.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you didn't, like, none of the countless names that we have to say to recognize their humanity, from Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, and let's go back, even Amadou Diallo, right? We can go all the way back there. We could
Antoine Black, Corin Gaines.
yeah, Alton Sterling,
Yeah.
Fernando Castile, right? All of these names, Laquan McDonald, all of these names. And the surprise portion of it is, you didn't realize that this was going on. And that leads us to the acceptance, or the realization, that there's a major education problem, a re-education that has to happen, because there's been an assumption of criminality, whether it has been implicitly understood or accepted or recognized, um, by by viewers, by non-black people, that each of these individuals, to some degree, probably brought whatever action occurred. They brought their own death. They were complicit in their own oppression, in their own death, to some degree. And of course, we recognize that the media has played a big role, in how we respond as a society. Those who are willing to uh, indulge those suppositions of criminality, of inherent criminality, and so if they see that this person has a criminal record, that is enough for them to give the benefit of the doubt to the system.
Mm-hmm.
And you know so the position that it puts many Black Muslims, particularly those who may have some semblance of notoriety, or or following, or whatever it is, it puts them in a position, or I would say, if I include myself in that, in a position where now we are charged with, or asked to educate non-Black Muslims about something that to us seemed like it was quite apparent, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a structural re-education, a systemic re-education that has to take place. And in addition to the grieving and the frustration and the shame, um, that this latest iteration of disregard for Black life and Black humanity, it is also the responsibility that has been placed and rejected by some. I'll just say it quite clearly, that we want you to teach us how to recognize what, in most of our minds, is something that should have been clear as day for you from the get-go. So it's kind of scaffolds the some of the difficulty of the moment.
And this is tough because I've also seen calls for non-Black Muslims or just non-Black people to take a seat and be quiet and listen and learn. And so, and on one hand, that is the need of the day, is for people to learn. But then on the other hand, there's this extreme burden on people like yourself and others who are already going through the trauma of witnessing this over and over again, to people that in their community, in their families, reliving that trauma, and then also having to educate. So it's, I can only make dua for people like you who have taken up the mantle and have and realize that this is the time where the world's attention is on this issue. So, and and may God reward you for everything. For this is a jihad that you're doing. You're educating, even despite the fact that this should not completely fall on your shoulders. So thank you so much on behalf of, I know, our audience and all of those around the world who may be watching and listening. We know in the United States, we have a prison industrial complex. And what does this mean for those of you who may never have heard this term before? The United States makes up 5% of the world's population. And yet 21 to 25% of the entire world's prison population is in the United States. So let that sink in. 5% of the total world population, yet 21 to 25% of the entire world's prison population. Mm-hmm. So, and as we look further into those statistics, Black people account for 34% of the correctional population. They're incarcerated at 5 times the rate, more than white people. The imprisonment rate of Black women is twice the rate for white women. Black children represent 23% of those who are arrested. 42% of the children who are detained, and 52% of the children whose cases are judicially waived to criminal court. And we've had many speakers on here, many guests on here who have spoken to this, the prison to school to prison pipeline, where our communities, our cities spend more money on building baby prisons instead of juvenile facilities, as they're called, instead of spending more money on schools, on education system, on youth and health services. And this is something that, and there are many more statistics we could talk about. The same Black and white people have relatively the same drug usage rates, but Black people are arrested for drug usage at a rate of 6 times of that of the white population. Right. Black people represent 12.5% of illicit drug users, but 25% of those arrested for drug offenses, and 33% of those incarcerated for drug. So look at I know sometimes numbers are hard for people to understand, but just realize that this is a systematic issue. This is something people make money out of. They're private prisons across the United States. And this is what and so, we could read statistics all day long, but I wanted to focus a little bit on Muslims in prison. A lot of Muslims who are in prison don't have any religious accommodations like food, respect for their diet, prayer mats, religious books. Many states prevent Muslims from practicing their faith while they're in prison. And there's statistically high occurrence of non-Muslim incarcerated criminals converting to Islam while in prison. About 30 to 40,000 prisoners do this every year in the American prison system. We've had Imam Ali, who has spoken about this, about his own experiences. We've talked about the brotherhood, how people find a system, a family in prison, and so this is a lot of this stems from that. So we'll come back to some of this, but can you explain to our audience what is mass incarceration? Like, what does that, some people, a lot of people, especially who have never been in a courthouse or have never been stopped by the police, don't understand incarceration in the United States.
That's a great question. And I want to frame this first. I want to, from an empirical standpoint, I'll say this. Well, you know what? Before I say that, let me just kind of jump back and really quickly just address one of the things that you said about how some of the narrative right now is if you're not Black, then kind of just step back right now and allow Black folks to talk about this and deal with this issue. I'm going to push back on that and say that there's no singular method or approach that is going to relieve us as a human family of this disease. It is going to take every single person, and to that, quickly, I'll say there's a narration which I'll give you the paraphrase version. Basically, to remove litter or an obstacle from the road is an act of charity, right? It is an act of service, because you may not know who's coming behind you, but you know that it's going to make it easier and safer for them to move down that road. That being said, it is imperative that each and every person who understands the concept of human dignity and who understands our interconnectedness, it is imperative that each and every individual do what they can wherever they can to further that reality, to make sure that that is something that is secure for all of us. We understand that if it's not secured for one of us, it's not secured for any of us, right? If one of us is not free, none of us are free. So I invite people, for those who are listening, if you are, you're white, you're South Asian, you're Arab, whatever your ethnicity, your distinction is, to operate to your fullest capacity in those spaces that you're in, to push back against this anti-Blackness, to push back against white supremacy, and to promote human dignity, and to do it wherever you can, period. So with regard to mass incarceration, in 1973, the Bureau of Prisons, when they did their annual report, there were roughly about 300,000 people that were incarcerated in 73. And the projection was that those numbers would actually go down. They would decline. Now, this is in stark contrast, obviously, to not even a decade later, once it was determined that we would embrace this war on drugs after Black and brown communities were flooded with drugs that, we don't have boats, we don't have poppy farms and all of this other stuff, and we're not processing, we ain't got no coca leaves in the hood. But these things were strategically introduced into these communities, and then met with the proportional response of law enforcement as a way to counter that. So when we think about mass incarceration, of course, now we have we have this huge system from the court systems, your state, your prosecutors, state and federal. We have sentencing guidelines that are established. We have disparate sentencing that takes place. where if you're white, that you get a sentence that that is typically lower. I mean, it's been illustrated in terms of the of cocaine versus crack, of how that sentencing played out for the longest, where you got more, a whole lot more time for possession of crack than you did for cocaine. Of course, they had some type of a ideological, justification for that. But the fact is that from a systemic level, um, from prosecution to the allocation of resources within municipalities where you got minority majority communities, where the biggest line item is going to be police services or policing in these communities, not mental health, not economic investment, not education, but policing.
Mhm.
So the system is set up in such a way where you can have, it produces those statistics where you have, African Americans being 5 times more, or 1 in 5 or 1 in 4, um, uh, you know, having the likelihood of being in prison. Um, it produces a reality I think best captured by, if you haven't read, folks, the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which just really breaks this, the whole mass incarceration system down. It is a must read. If you haven't read Slavery by Another Name, The Reenslavement of Black Americans by Douglas Blackman, it's also a documentary you can look at.
Mhm.
It talks about, it shows you that the system of mass incarceration is simply a reintroduction or a reformation of chattel slavery, and the goals being to remove as many African Americans from society, right?
Mm.
Keep them in a position where they have no agency. And I know I didn't touch on the African American um, position, or population, or Muslim population just in general in prisons, but um, it all starts from that particular viewpoint of looking to maintain a control of a group of people that we don't want you in society. We're gonna do what we can to use a system to curtail your freedom.
Mm. And one of the things that is often, we see these in shows, we see this in policy meetings. There's this portrayal of the prison building expansion as a means of creating employment opportunities and utilization of inmate labor. And these are very particularly harmful elements of the prison industrial complex, as they boast about clear economic benefits at the expense of the incarcerated populace. So, what are some of the first steps that we as Muslims can do to combat the injustices that are superimposed upon the African American community? And specifically, perhaps we can talk about African American Muslims disproportionately that stem from the prison industrial complex.
Do you mean what can we do to change the system as it exists for those inside, or uh, maybe those circumstances leading up to imprisonment? Like,
So some of the things, the first steps that just we know that this is particularly affects Muslim populations. We know that it particularly affects the Black population. So we know it affects the Black Muslim population. So what can some of those that are outside can do to assist in dismantling this? It's just first steps. Let's, before we even get into the complicated other steps that we can do, um, post
okay.
George Floyd and in this prison abolition movement. But what can we do, just as people who are who are have found out about this and are worried?
Well, I think one of the things is going to be recognizing the points of contact between Black communities and the police, right?
Mhm.
And you could take that back to to the schools, right? And that's why there is a school to prison pipeline,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, that is termed that because you have a police presence in the schools, and you have and not just even if they're not in the schools, which most are, they refer to them as community resource officers, um, but the pushing back against the acceptance of that being of that being an environment that's conducive for education when it is absolutely not. Pushing back or making sure that those who are teaching in these communities that they are culturally aware, culturally sensitive, and they're not teaching under assumptions of with bias, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not teaching with assumptions that um, the speech or mannerisms or things that are culturally identifiable within the African American community, right? And I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but I'm saying, but if you don't have the cultural sensitivity and understanding to see that, to not criminalize the actions of our young people, to not criminalize their an outburst or a statement or just their very bodies, and your response is to bring in the police, which do not de-escalate or
Mm-hmm.
often not, right? And this is that person's introduction into that pipeline. So just in this instance, what can be done is to be aware of the structure of the school system,
Mm-hmm.
right? And if you happen to be, you may not live in the city, you may not live, that may not be your necessarily your reality, but you should be thinking, if there's one or two African Americans in the school, you're in a majority area where black folks are the minority, and you should and you can make sure that there is an education component that is going on, that training, since sensitivity training is going on, but from a district level, that so that all the students, all the teachers, I'm sorry, all the teachers and administrators, that they're on board and they're aware of how our young people are responded to, and how the school, which should be a safe zone, is often the introduction for them into the prison pipeline. So I think just in that one example, I think it's being aware of the policies, uh, being aware of the people, the training that's taking place whenever you have African American, you have black folks, young people in particular, present, to make sure that they're not being criminalized from the start.
Okay. And what about channeling zakat? So into so many Muslim prisoners, and this is something that I know here in Washington D.C. Imam Ali talks about a lot. Is a lot of here when we work with Rashidun D.C. A lot of the zakat goes directly to those who are in prison because they don't have that money helps with mail, with buying toothbrushes, toothpaste, things like that, just to get them through the day, through to the time when they get to meet their lawyers, just posting bail for people. So is that so I would like for you to talk a little bit about that.
Well, sister, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because yes, absolutely, that is definitely something that as a community, that can be done. All of you who are listening now, those who are listening in the future, that is definitely something that you can do, an action you can take. You can support organizations like Believers Bailout, that make sure that folks are not incarcerated because they are economically insecure, because you're being further punished because you're poor,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is just absolutely unethical. So yeah, so that's one. And I think everything that I kind of talked about before was like, what do you do before that? Because honestly, we want to get to the point where we have to disrupt the system, right? It's one thing is to respond to the needs of those who are in the system, and I can tell you this. I was a correctional officer for I did about 3 years as a correctional officer, like 23 years ago, something like that. And I recognize the I think the gravity that Islam has in that space, in that particular environment. It's a very powerful force. And there definitely needs to be more support given to those who, whether they were Muslim before or they enter Islam, in that environment, there definitely can be more support that we're giving to these men and women, and whether it is writing to them, which I think is also something that is really important, having lines of communication. If it is, like I said, supporting organizations that are putting up people's bail, or if it's putting money on their commissary, if it is, if an organization does not exist that is dealing with administration, which in a bureaucracy can be overwhelming at times, but to make sure that folks got prayer rugs, they have Qurans, they have because we don't have Muslim chaplains, and that's not the norm everywhere, right? But to make sure that they have, whether it's volunteer or if they got one on staff, that they have an opportunity to have the religious assembly and education. These are things that we can definitely do from the outside for our brothers and sisters who are on the inside, and we should be mindful of doing that. So find an organization, and I'll start with easiest one. Start with Believers Bailout, or the Masajid, if you know of a Masajid that's doing that kind of work as well. Support these organizations that are doing the work that most folks don't want to really do.
Okay. And obviously, once they're really some of these brothers and sisters get released from jail, then actually helping them find jobs, support, clothes that they can even go for a job interview, things like having policy changes made, like
Yes.
especially when someone is put into jail on a false charge, just getting the state to recognize, so if now they apply for a job and they were in prison for 10 years on a false charge, getting the state to call them that for that 10 years they were working for the state of, Florida or Georgia, that can change someone's life around. Especially someone who's been, was innocent and has been falsely accused, which also happens. Now, all of these terrible injustices that are systematic, that are taking place. What do you say about the prison abolition movement, who are calling for structural reforms in the prison system to change how we think about and handle criminal activity in the justice system?
You know what? I will start once again. I think I opened up one of the things I said, that we're in a position now where we're trying to figure out what are the right words to use to describe where we are. So from a semantic point, I heard a wonderful interview. The sisters, I'm sure you probably know her, Miriam Kaba. And she introduced me to some new terminology, which is the criminal punishment system. Not the criminal justice, but the criminal punishment system. And from and those words, that description matters. And it matters because while we're thinking about how to respond to mass incarceration, the prison industrial complex, we also have to realize that it's built intentionally upon the devaluation of Black bodies, right, in particular. And it is also built upon this idea that some of us, whatever your ethnicity is, some of us are expendable, right, for the benefit of a few, right? And this is where the empirical data comes in, and it can be used in favor of the prisons, and it can be used to show that we're better off without them, right? So in terms of the abolition the abolition movement, uh, defunding the police. Uh, the way that I see this is that um, it hasn't worked from a from an just from an empirical standpoint. It hasn't worked. The fact that, as you mentioned, we are what, 5% of the population,
Yes.
and we're over a quarter of the of those who are in prison globally are from the United States. That,
Yes.
I mean, that in itself should tell you that the system is not working for anybody but a very select few.
Hmm.
Okay, so what we're looking at, as I see it, is that we have to embrace this idea. We have to embrace structural change, and if that means that we have to destroy a system to build a new one, a better one, sometimes that's what has to be done. Um, uh, we just look at the ravage that the system has brought on generations of black families, right? Going back to chattel slavery,
Hmm.
and to Jim Crow, and to where we are right now with the prison industrial complex. Um, it is unconscionable for us to think that trying to maintain this system is ethical, that is in the benefit of public safety. It is absolutely not. So we have to find ways of promoting community safety while removing the danger of policing as it exists. We have to find ways of responding proactively so that criminality is something that is learned. It is not something that any of us come here with, but we've been operating with this reactionary model that has been encouraged and kind of ingrained in us, where people say, well, what are we going to do if we don't have police, or what are we going to do if we don't have prisons? Well, if we don't have prisons, that means that we got a whole lot of money that we can spend on education, that we can spend on arts, on culture, a whole lot of money that we can spend on raising up these communities that have been disinvested in, and allowed to blight, that produce criminality from a Quranic standpoint. We understand, a lot. We're reminded that Shaitan beckons you to shameful behavior, right? And he does that through poverty, right? Poverty and ignorance. These things, they go hand in hand, and the product is never good. So if we remove these things, these factors, then we don't have the need for prisons as they exist. We don't have the need for police forces as they exist. Um,
And there's been a glorification of these police forces through our media, through our TV shows. Cops just got canceled, but that's not the only show. How many of us like grew up on, crime and justice? What is that? SVU unit,
yeah,
all of that, and like these beautiful people with these gorgeous hairstyles, and they're the cops, and you just sort of grow up thinking that this is like, oh, a world without this would be unfathomable. And so this is something also for the South Asian community or the Arab community, immigrant community, which is really interesting for me to observe, is that when you go overseas, you visit overseas, normal, I'm just going to say middle class, or maybe the elite, or maybe not even, like, let's just talk about even lay people, hardworking, working class people. They do not want to interact with the police. No respectable person would want to ever go to the police station or bring a police person inside their home. It's considered, taboo. So why
mm,
do we come over here, those of us who are from immigrant backgrounds, and seem to think that this is accepted, that suddenly policing has changed? And yes, policing in the United States is it has deep roots in slavery, and but it's also because of how American movies are perceived throughout the world. It's also like a beacon or a statement, like something, a standard for people around the world to look at, right? So that's something else too. Like, we really have to examine within ourselves, like, why would I not let a police officer anywhere near my family overseas, yet over here we insist that they are here to protect us, and they're protecting our masajid, and they're just like, are just really ingrained within our community. So yeah, just that was just an observation that.
That's and I think that's a very interesting observation, because that probably takes us into a conversation we don't have time for now, but just the assumption or the aspiration toward whiteness that exists here. The whiteness as a property, whiteness as an entry point, as a way to secure all of the liberties and opportunities that the United States of America is said to offer. Because in general, in general, when white people call the police, it is not, it is not the same type of interaction that you find in, where it's a black or brown person in dealing with the police. Now, for those who, don't understand what those interactions look like, well, I think people do. I shouldn't even make that assumption that people don't understand. It's accepting and recognizing. And I'm going to pause real quick, and just because I see my brother Bill Chambers, his comment about one of the other things that you can do is to get the training from, and thanks so much for putting it up, from Muslim ARC, Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative.
Yeah.
They do a phenomenal job on anti-blackness training, and also Islamophobia. So two things that we're dealing with as a community, but not always recognizing the connection between those two things. So yeah, but our police, our police, it has been glorified. We are the victims of propaganda here. Our military has been propagandized. The same thing. It's authority. Back in the day, growing up, I remember the games they talked about. We didn't play this as a kid, but I'm old enough to remember cowboys and Indians, right? Everybody wanted to be a cowboy, right? And it's the same now. Grow up, you playing cops and robbers. Everybody wants to be the cop, but you realize there's a power dynamic at play that we're accepting and we're laying out, and everybody can't be a cop. And that authority is not something that's they're held accountable for. So I mean, we're an ethical mess. We're an absolute ethical mess. And that doesn't discount the individual good cops, but the fact is, I don't know how many videos you've seen of police officers arresting other police officers while they're in the commission of a crime, or while they're brutalizing a minority, while they're brutalizing, anybody for that matter. Those videos don't exist.
Exactly. And it's systematic because it's ingrained in this entire system. It starts with the police force. They're designated to be first responders in so many crime scenes. And then there's multiple reports of unfairly accusing, arresting, beating, raping, and killing those in the marginalized communities for no reason. And then they're arrested. They accuse and arrest people of, specifically Black people, several times. Then they accuse and arrest white people. And then it moves on to the prison system. There are far more people from marginalized communities in the prison system than those in the privileged communities. It's also harder to bail them out of prison, even if they have not committed a crime. And that arrest record is forever there unless it's specifically removed. And in addition, some prisons with higher numbers of marginalized people have much worse sanitary, health, and other conditions than prisons that cater to wealthier or more privileged populations. And then it moves on to the justice system, where you have to work 10 times as hard to achieve justice for someone from a marginalized community than you have to for someone who's from a privileged community. Right. And so if you follow all the rules of the courts and take your case to every lawyer and every court you possibly can, sometimes the judges in the courts will refuse to grant you justice because of their own internal discriminatory practices. I was just looking at this one case in Florida with the exact same crime, exact same numbers, like they assigned them points. And both, there was a white man and a black man, 148.2, 148.2. But the difference, one was serving 2 years in prison and the other was serving 28 years in prison. So just that, so even if you make it past all the way in front of a judge, and then when you put all the police, the prison system, and the judge system, then all of that together, it's set up for you to lose. While people who have been stealing like millions of dollars from like the Exxon folks, or Barry Madoff, or all these people who steal like billions of dollars, are living in lush gated communities, basically.
Yeah, there's something. I mean, we think about the system and how there's such a tremendous lack of accountability and oversight. I mean, and it's in every facet of it. Whether we're talking about judicially, prosecutors, whether we're talking about qualified immunity that is for police officers, that's getting a lot of attention right now. We're at a position where we think about, I want to just kind of take this back to like Believers Bailout and the work that they're doing on behalf of Muslims in prison. Some of us, we could think about the way that Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and praise be upon him, how he would engage prisoners, how they were engaged during his time, and they were engaged with they were given the opportunity to learn and to change and to actually reintegrate into society. Okay. Now, but what's important about this is that these were during times of war. This is not a war, right? The treatment is something that we can definitely look at from an ethical standpoint, but situationally, this is not a war that Black folks are willingly going into. This is a war that this is an act of oppression, right? It's a system designed to catch and bring folks into a system, and even when they leave with the mark of criminality on them, the assumption of criminality, with the with that felony on them, right? I know in Illinois there are at least 1,000 licenses that you cannot get as a felon, whether you are a violent felon or a non-violent felon, which directly impacts your ability to integrate into society, to take on responsibility, to have a family, to earn a livable wage. This is systemic, and it's designed. So I encourage everyone, wherever you are, whatever state you're in, to really look at what are the laws that these men and women are going to have to contend with in terms of trying to have a normal life, to be reintegrated into society. So that's one of the things that we got to look at, and we have to do a lot of things at the same time. Deconstructing this system, and also dealing with it as it is, trying to mitigate some of the harm that it has caused and continues to cause. And a lot of that's going to be through our civic engagement. It's going to be through through us voting and voting in the people that are holding our interest, the human interest, at the center, and not the interests of the few that have profited from this system.
So this is something, let's talk a little bit about the Islamic justice system. What does that look like? And that, and obviously we don't have much time, but that would be something that perhaps, and you touched upon this for a little bit. One story that and it's not Islamic, but this is a story that it comes from a particular tribe in the whole continent of Africa. I don't know. They didn't pinpoint which also gets me very upset. But where the tribe's ethos was that if someone committed something harmful to the rest of the tribe, or committed a crime, the elders and the people around the tribe would gather in the central square, and the person would be brought in, and they would send and everybody in the community would remind them of their goodness, remind them of the good
Mm,
things that they ever did, remind us of who they are, what their lineage is, who their ancestors were, to shame them, and but to correct them, to correct their to make them realize the path that they have chosen is not the path that they should be choosing. So you're you know rectifying and bringing someone back to the right path at the very beginning of their life, in in on a negative path. So that is something that was so that really touched, like mental health wise, um, families, just bringing that whole village in to really. And so that was just a beautiful alternative method, um, of people around the world doing restorative justice. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you of any other alternatives that you have identified in your work.
there's two things that come to mind. Number one, we've got a variety of ways that have been specified that zakat can be employed, right? And one of them, there's one particular segment of folks that that is critically important in this conversation, and that is orphans,
Mm,
right? When we think about those people, these young people who do not have the benefit of having that social foundation, that moral foundation, to help raise them up, this
mm,
this idea of zakat, not just the money itself, not just the funds, but understanding that that funding for structures have to be put in place to mitigate the loss of their guardians, of their parents, to help out the single mother, to help out that brother that is trying to get back on his feet, right? Um, this is something that we should be really thinking about in terms of how our zakat is used, and who does our zakat reach, and is it reaching, and is it being used in a way where it's able to be amplified, right?
mm,
Is it a part of a system? Is it part of a structure? Because systems counter systems, structures counter structures. This idea of rugged individualism, that I can just get out here and do it all by myself, it is absolutely false, right? Ours is a religion that, matter of fact, just as humanity, we're defined by our relationships, the way we respond to one another. And one of the things, the last things that I'll mention here is that as as a people who believe that our creator, right, that Allah has inscribed the rule of mercy upon himself in the way he deals with us, his human creation, right, whom he could just wipe out if he chose to, right, who he says that if he was to hold you all to account, us all, men and jinn, for what we've done, there would be nothing left, right? But he deals with us from a position of mercy. So why can't we also understand that the system that we have been witnessing is one that says you are absolutely the worst thing that you have ever done.
mm,
You are absolutely the mistakes that you have made. That is who you are. And Islam is redemptive, right? It is mercy. It allows us to recognize what we've done, the mistakes that we've made, but it allows us to the opportunity to be better, and to be judged in that way. So we we can't have anything less, honestly, than a changing of the mindset and the spirit of the system. The system is broken, and it produces brokenness, and that is how we have to respond to this in a way that allows us to be whole human beings. And I love that story, and I believe I may have heard that before, about how people who have done wrong, how they've been responded to by the community. It's a community responsibility, and
mm.
we have to remind ourselves that we can be better. Inshallah, we will be better.
We will be better. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you to our audience for being here today as well. We want to remind everybody that if you're in Chicago, join the Muslim Abolition March. It's on the south side of Chicago, and it's being led by Believers Bailout. And Imam, our guest, Imam Tariq, will be leading the khutbah there. And, this is Friday in Chicago. Thank you so much to everyone who tuned in. Assalamu alaikum.